The idea that the military-industrial complex, MIC, starts wars is a provocative claim that has been a topic of debate for many years. The military-industrial complex refers to the symbiotic relationship between a nation's military, its government, and the private defense contractors that supply weapons, technology, and other services to the military. This relationship, as first articulated by U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower in his farewell address in 1961, highlights the potential for undue influence by the defense industry on national policy, particularly in the context of war and military spending. Eisenhower famously warned that the military-industrial complex, if left unchecked, could wield too much power, leading to the promotion of policies that might favor military action over diplomacy, diplomacy over peace, or escalate conflicts for economic or strategic gain. Eisenhower's warning touched on the concern that the interests of defense contractors and the military might align with policies that encourage or prolong wars for profit, as these conflicts can lead to increased military spending and greater demand for weapons and services. So, does the military-industrial complex start wars? While it is not accurate to say that the military-industrial complex single-handedly starts wars, it certainly plays a significant role in shaping foreign policy decisions and the way wars are fought. Several factors come into play in understanding the potential influence of the MIC on the initiation and perpetuation of wars. The influence of the military-industrial complex. 1. Economic incentives for war. One of the primary criticisms of the military-industrial complex is that the defense industry profits significantly from war and military conflict. Companies that manufacture weapons, planes, ships, and other military technologies often rely on large government contracts, which tend to increase during times of conflict or heightened military tension. War creates demand for these goods and services, which can translate into enormous profits for defense contractors. The incentive to maintain or increase military spending can create a war-driven economy, where those invested in the defense industry have a vested interest in promoting policies that lead to armed conflict. This can take many forms, such as lobbying for increased defense budgets, pushing for intervention in global hotspots, or even exaggerating threats to national security to justify military escalation. For example, the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War and the Iraq War has been scrutinized for the way defense contractors and military leaders, many of whom had ties to the MIC, pushed for military action. In the case of Iraq, some critics argue that the war was partly motivated by the desire to secure lucrative contracts for companies like Halliburton, which was run by Dick Cheney before he became vice president, and Lockheed Martin. These companies benefited not just from the direct cost of weapons sales but also from reconstruction contracts in war-torn countries. 2. Lobbying and political influence. Defense contractors are some of the largest and most powerful lobbying groups in Washington, D.C. They spend millions of dollars annually influencing policy decisions, funding political campaigns, and shaping public opinion about military engagement. These lobbying efforts can lead to policies that favor military intervention abroad, even when the U.S. public or international community might not support such actions. The revolving door between government and the defense industry is another critical factor. High-ranking military officials often leave the armed forces and take high-paying jobs in the defense sector, and defense executives often have strong ties to lawmakers and regulators. This interconnection between the military, politicians, and the defense industry raises concerns about conflicts of interest and undue influence over national security policy. An example of this dynamic is the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Critics of the war argue that the close ties between the defense industry, especially companies like Halliburton and Bechtel, and key political figures in the Bush administration, led to decisions that prioritized military action for profit-driven reasons. The argument is that the military-industrial complex played a part in shaping the political narrative and justifying the war to the public, particularly through the use of misinformation about weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. 3. Perpetuating conflict for profit. A key concern regarding the military-industrial complex is its role in perpetuating conflict. Wars, especially prolonged ones, can be incredibly profitable for defense contractors. Once a war is initiated, there is often little incentive for it to end quickly, especially if powerful economic interests are benefiting from its continuation. In situations like the War on Terror, the U.S. military's operations in Afghanistan and Iraq involved substantial and sustained defense contracts, which incentivized military engagement on a long-term basis. The defense industry is invested in the war economy, so it can be argued that this incentivizes the prolongation of conflict or the escalation of military activity, as the companies involved continue to make profits. Some critics also point out that the military-industrial complex benefits from the idea of a permanent war economy, where the U.S. or other nations are continually engaged in some form of military activity or arms buildup. This state of readiness, while not explicitly advocating for war, can normalize the idea of conflict as an ongoing and necessary part of national security policy. 4. The New Pearl Harbor Argument, Neoconservatism. Some critics of the military-industrial complex argue that the 9/11 attacks and subsequent war on terror were an example of how the MIC and political elites can influence the direction of foreign policy. While there is no conclusive evidence that the MIC orchestrated the 9/11 attacks, the event provided an opportunity for military contractors and political leaders to pursue long-term wars in the Middle East. The Project for the New American Century, PNAC, a neoconservative think tank, famously argued in a 2000 report that the U.S. needed a new Pearl Harbor to galvanize public support for an expanded military presence in the Middle East. Critics argue that the 9/11 attacks created the kind of shock needed to justify military intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq, wars that would benefit defense contractors through increased demand for military hardware, security services, and rebuilding contracts. 5. The role of national security state and militarization. Another aspect of the military-industrial complex's influence is the increasing militarization of U.S. foreign policy and domestic security. The U.S. military-industrial complex, with its vast technological capabilities and infrastructure, also extends into areas like surveillance, intelligence, and homeland security. As the U.S. military grew increasingly involved in counterterrorism and nation-building missions abroad, contractors increasingly profited from the growth of the national security state. This perpetual state of war on terror and militarization serves to create a sustained demand for defense spending and weapons contracts. In this sense, it could be argued that the military-industrial complex helps sustain an environment in which wars, or at least prolonged military occupations, are seen as a constant fixture of national policy, regardless of the immediate justification for conflict. Conclusion: does the military-industrial complex start wars? While the military-industrial complex does not start wars in a direct, conspiracy-like sense, it undeniably plays a significant role in shaping the conditions that make wars more likely and, in some cases, more prolonged. By exerting influence over political leaders, pushing for military intervention, and benefiting financially from conflict, the MIC creates a set of incentives that can encourage military engagement. However, it's important to note that wars are rarely the result of a single factor. Geopolitical dynamics, national security concerns, ideological beliefs, and economic interests all contribute to the decision to go to war. The military-industrial complex, as a powerful economic and political force, is just one piece of the puzzle. Ultimately, the question of whether the MIC starts wars is less about any grand conspiracy and more about understanding how the relationship between government, the military, and defense contractors can lead to policies that favor military engagement, sometimes at the cost of diplomacy or peace.